what you unconsciously allowed to persist. Not because you lacked dignity, but because somewhere along the way you were conditioned to believe that love meant endurance, that pain was passion in disguise, and that to care meant to stay silent. This is not weakness, this is programming. Carl Jung did not write for shelves or admiration. He wrote to break the trance of unconscious suffering, to lift the veil from the soul and reveal the invisible chains that bind us to destructive patterns, especially those masked as devotion. Today, we offer you a message not of judgment, but of awakening. This is not a lesson in blame, but a journey through recognition. Because when you spend years rationalizing what shatters your nervous system, your mind begins to normalize the chaos, your spirit begins to dim, and the whisper of your intuition is slowly drowned out by the noise of survival. Jung once warned, "What you do not make conscious will manifest as fate. What you continue to tolerate without awareness becomes the very script you unknowingly relive." This essay is not theory. It is a mirror. It is a compass meant to help you name and no longer excuse the behaviors that corrode your peace. And not just name them, but reclaim yourself in the naming. The person who always minimizes, deflects, or invalidates you. The one who weaponizes silence. The one whose presence leaves you shrinking so they can feel bigger. These are not quirks. These are signals. And if left unchecked, they become the architecture of a life lived in quiet betrayal. There comes a point, often in stillness, when you begin to feel the inner unrest, when something in you can no longer swallow the weight of your own silence. Perhaps you're here today because that moment has already begun. Perhaps you've had to dim your joy so another wouldn't feel eclipsed by your light. Perhaps you said, "It's okay," when your heart was breaking just to keep the peace. But peace built on self-erasure is not peace at all. It's exile from the self. And Jung's work reminds us that no true healing can happen without first illuminating what we've exiled. That is why we're here, not to coddle you, but to help you rise, because healing begins where justification ends. When you stop justifying what wounds you, you reclaim what once felt irretrievable. Your voice, your boundaries, your essence. Ask yourself, how many times have you said, "It's nothing," when your whole body knew it was something? How many chances have you handed to someone who didn't even honor the first? How many versions of yourself have you buried just to fit inside someone else's comfort zone? This isn't about hatred. This is about stopping the self-betrayal. Jung taught that the shadow is the keeper of everything we refuse to feel. And every time you tolerate the intolerable, a piece of you slips into that darkness. But it doesn't vanish. It waits. It aches. It calls you. That's not weakness. It's your soul refusing to be silenced any longer. There are boundaries you haven't drawn because you feared losing someone. But the cost of that fear has been losing yourself. And when that cost is paid daily, your soul begins to suffocate. This essay is here to help you breathe again. There are things you were never meant to tolerate, not because you're fragile, but because you're sacred. This isn't extremism, it's clarity. Emotional chaos should not be your home. Repeated dismissiveness is not a flaw, it's a decision, and if you don't learn to see it, it will rob you of your peace. Jung made it clear, what you fail to integrate, you are doomed to repeat. And if you continue to justify mistreatment in the name of love, your unconscious will keep recreating it. Not because you don't matter, but because no one ever taught you that you do. Perhaps you're in a relationship now. Perhaps you've recently left. Perhaps you're floating in the in-between, unsure of what healing even looks like. Wherever you are, this message will offer you something essential: clarity. Because every one of these 10 unacceptable behaviors has touched your life more than once. And it's time to stop seeing them as normal. We will not romanticize toxicity. We will reveal it. Because the first step toward healing is not forgiveness, it is truth. And truth brings a strength that no one can take from you, the power to choose differently. Jung said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But you're here. That means you've already decided to stop running. You've already outgrown denial. You're ready to reclaim what you lost in the name of survival. Some wounds do not scream, they whisper. Through passive silence, through subtle neglect, through the slow erosion of your vitality. And if you do not learn to recognize that language, you could live decades inside a pattern that repeats your original wound. The wound of not feeling worthy. This message is here to interrupt that pattern. It's not revenge, it's restoration. When you stop tolerating the intolerable, you write a new chapter with the ink of dignity. This channel does not exist to entertain you. It exists to awaken you, to help you name what no one has taught you how to name, so you stop confusing loyalty with emotional sacrifice. As you read or listen, you might feel anger or grief or a disorientation you can't yet explain. Let it come. That discomfort is the stirring of buried wisdom. Let it speak. Every emotion that surfaces is proof that you are finally ready to process what was once too heavy to hold. And when you reach the final word of this essay, you will not be the same. Not because we changed you, but because you allowed yourself to remember. You will no longer justify what harms your soul and call it love. You will no longer betray your essence to keep someone who won't protect it. This essay is your mirror, but it's also your doorway, a reflection of what you endured, and a bridge to what you are now ready to create. There are relationships that arrive to show you what you deserve, but there are others that arrive only to show you what you must never accept again. You are not broken for having tolerated too much. You are brave for being willing to stop. You are awake, you are aware, and that is more than enough to begin. So stay with us, because what you are about to hear could change your life. These are the 10 unacceptable behaviors Carl Jung, in his profound understanding of the soul, would never advise you to tolerate. Not because you're weak, but because your soul is far too precious to suffocate in spaces where it cannot breathe. There is a form of harm that seldom screams, but instead whispers its way into the corners of your psyche. It does not arrive violently, but in the soft guilt you feel when asserting a boundary, in the subtle shame that rises when you express a need, in the quiet discomfort of knowing you are disappointing someone simply by being true to yourself. This is emotional manipulation, hidden, insidious, and tragically familiar. And though it may be cloaked in affection, its aim is precise, to make you abandon your essence to preserve a connection. Jung warned us that the soul becomes ill when its truth is denied. This denial begins not with grand betrayals, but with the small, daily decisions to silence yourself, to avoid emotional punishment. It is not love that asks you to disappear, it is fear wearing love's mask. The first step to healing is not heroic, it is subtle and courageous. It is noticing the exact moment when you shrink, not out of love, but out of survival. You can begin by gently naming those moments. Make a list, not to accuse, but to awaken. When did you act from guilt instead of authenticity? What faces show up in that pattern? Which voices echo in your mind when you say yes, but feel no? This is how the soul begins to reclaim its voice. And then there is the cruelty that calls itself truth. Those who pierce your heart with sharp words and justify it by claiming honesty are not being sincere. They are wielding weaponized candor. Jung taught that the human personality thrives not through harshness, but through recognition. Words without empathy do not awaken, they wound. And wounds that are dismissed grow roots in your unconscious, shaping your self-worth in silence. If you've ever internalized a phrase that made you feel small, ask yourself, was it constructive or was it control in disguise? Which statements still replay in your head like old recordings? Not all feedback is true. Some of it is veiled domination. And your worth was never meant to be carved out by someone else's opinion. The next disguise is control masked as care. I'm only doing your friendships, choosing your direction or defining your space. But love does not imprison, it expands. When someone tries to manage your world to protect you, they are often shielding themselves from their chaos. their insecurity, and their fear of losing dominance. Jung saw this as the shadow's distortion of power, the need to control others when one has lost control within. Reflect gently. Where has your freedom been trimmed under the name of love? What decisions were made for you, not with you? And what price have you paid for that trade? More dangerous still is emotional distortion, known now as gaslighting. Here, the manipulation is not external, it seeps into your own mind. You feel something deeply, only to be told you're too sensitive, imagining things or overreacting. It begins to feel like you can't trust yourself. Jung said that what irritates us in others can often teach us about ourselves. But there is a difference between projection and erasure. When your reality is persistently denied, your sense of self fractures, your emotions become foreign, your certainty begins to decay. Go back to a moment where you felt something clearly: grief, fear, joy, and then were told it was invalid. What did you say to yourself afterward? Took root in that silence. Then comes the silent violence of invalidation, the diminishing of your dreams, your ideas, and your soul's language simply happens because they do not match someone else's world. Jung taught that what we repress, we become enslaved by. And every time you silence a part of yourself to maintain harmony, that inner flame dims, but it does not die. It waits, aching to speak again. Ask yourself, what parts of you have been muted to avoid conflict? What desires still whisper in your bones, asking for room to breathe? Empathy, too, is not optional. It is the bridge to human connection. And while all of us may occasionally fail to empathize, some people never do. They minimize your pain, redirect every story back to themselves, and leave you emotionally alone in moments when you needed to be held. Over time, this erodes your inner life. Jung reminded us that without empathy, relationships become transactions, not sacred bonds. Think of the last time you were in pain, truly vulnerable. Did the person beside you offer presence or judgment? What did you actually need that day? And did you allow yourself to admit it? Repeated betrayal is another form of spiritual decay. A person may hurt you again and again, offering apologies without transformation, luring you into hope without change. Jung spoke of repetition as the residue of unhealed trauma. If someone continues to break your trust and you continue to stay, you are not in love. You are stuck in a cycle. Trace the timeline of "this is the last time in your life." What kept you anchored to a pattern that was clearly breaking you? And what fear lived beneath your silence? There is also selfishness, expertly camouflaged as independence. These are the individuals who give little, expect much, and orbit only their own needs. You carry the emotional labor. You reach out. You remember the birthdays. You forgive. They appear only when it serves them. This is not intimacy. It is emotional extraction. Ask yourself, where do you give more than 70%? What does that imbalance cost you? And when did you begin calling that loyalty? Sarcasm, when it becomes the only language, is a dagger coated in wit. It leaves no visible scars, but its poison is real. Jung believed that what we suppress surfaces in twisted forms, and sarcasm is often repressed resentment seeking a voice. Recall the barb jokes that haunted you. What truths were buried beneath their humor? What unspoken hurt tried to surface? And perhaps the most silent of all wounds, emotional indifference as punishment. The withholding of presence, the cold shoulder, the withdrawal of warmth, is not in grief but in power. It is not neutral. It is a form of abandonment that whispers, "You do not matter enough." Jung affirmed that we need a connection to remain whole. A systematic rejection is not absent, it is aggression in disguise. Remember a time when you were ignored on purpose? How did it shape your view of your own value? What part of you fought to be seen again? These 10 behaviors are not merely relationship red flags. They are spiritual wounds disguised as ordinary interactions. And Jung's psychology reminds us that what we do not make conscious, we are doomed to repeat. Recognition is not judgment, it is awakening. And when you name what you once tolerated, You reclaim the right to write a new story. Each of these behaviors is not just a passing discomfort, they are psychic imprints, seeds of inner disconnection that, over time, take root in the soil of your soul. They are not random reactions, but patterns that shape the architecture of your self-worth. The most dangerous part? The longer you tolerate them, the more familiar they become, until your spirit, wary and conditioned, begins to believe that this is what you deserve. But let us be absolutely clear. You do not deserve to be confused by love, silenced for having needs, minimized for your emotions, or used under the guise of care. You deserve a space, sacred, stable and whole, where you can breathe without fear, feel without guilt, speak without your words being turned into weapons. You deserve real love. And real love begins with the one relationship you've often neglected, your relationship with yourself. Carl Jung did not write to teach us how to despise others. He wrote to free us from the self-hatred we unconsciously carry for allowing what hurts us. That is the path to liberation, the line that separates repeating the past from transforming it. You cannot heal what you still justify. So pause. Gently return to each of the 10 patterns we've walked through. Ask yourself, with radical honesty, which one have I accepted as normal? Which one is hardest for me to admit? Which one has been woven through the chapters of my story for years without a name? Because the moment you name it, you break its spell. The moment you see it, you regain the freedom to choose something different. And here's the truth. You are no longer the same person who began watching this. Awareness has entered the room. Now you have the power to choose yourself. Not in theory, but in practice. If this message has stirred something within you, if it has touched the place that's been aching for clarity, then we invite you to mark this moment. Go to the comments and write these words, not just for us, but for you. I no longer trade my peace to remain in places that break me. Let it be your testament, your turning point, your declaration of sacred self-respect. Because today is not just another day, it is the beginning of life. You no longer have to apologize for choosing. When Jung spoke of the shadow, he wasn't only pointing to our wounds or flaws. He was also speaking of the parts of us we quietly abandon. Our voice, our boundaries, our instincts, our dignity. The shadow is not just where we store pain. It is where we bury everything we've been too afraid to protect within ourselves. And far too often, tolerating unacceptable behaviors is simply a hidden agreement with that shadow. Not because we are weak, but because there is still a part of us that doubts we are worthy of defending. Repeating toxic patterns in relationships is not proof of emotional failure. It is the echo of an unconscious wound that remains unhealed. Freud once described this as the compulsion to repeat, a psychological drive that emerges when a trauma has not been processed or integrated. So we return again and again to similar people, similar dynamics, similar pain. Not out of self-sabotage, but out of a quiet, unresolved hope that maybe this time it will end differently. But that hope, if left unexamined, can bind us to those who will only reopen the same wounds. When you begin to normalize manipulation, emotional distance, or a lack of empathy, what you're really doing is signing an emotional contract with your wound, not with words, but with your nervous system. You convince yourself, on a level deeper than logic, that a little affection is enough, even if it's wrapped in neglect, and that belief becomes the architecture of your relationships. But Jung reminded us of this: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This is not about blaming the ones who hurt you. Depth psychology does not ask you to hate, it asks you to awaken. Ask yourself how that experience shaped you and how it taught your unconscious to equate love with suffering. Because every time you tolerate something that violates your worth, you are training your inner world to believe that pain is love's cost. And there is something more quietly devastating than being hurt. It's justifying why you stayed hurt. That is the slow poison of unhealthy relationships. You learn to explain it away, You say things like, everyone makes mistakes, or nobody's perfect, or it wasn't that bad. However, the true damage is not always in what was done. It's in how you swallowed it, how you silenced yourself afterward, how your soul began shrinking to survive it. This is not merely theory. It is the silent psychology behind why we stay. Why do we call it love when it's really fear in disguise? And if you're not careful, that fear will become a compass that guides your relationships. So pause. Ask yourself, what parts of you have gone quiet? What boundaries have you tucked into the shadow? And are you willing now to bring them back into the light? When someone remains in relationships where they are belittled or emotionally humiliated, it is rarely because they lack alternatives. More often, it is because their emotional system has been conditioned, quietly, over time, to believe that anything is better than abandonment. The fear of being left alone becomes so intertwined with their sense of worth that even pain can feel safer than solitude. This is the place where Jung's work intersects with that of Alfred Adler. A deep-rooted sense of inferiority often leads us into unbalanced emotional bonds, where one person ends up carrying the entire weight of the connection, while the other remains emotionally absent or entitled. To decide that something is no longer tolerable is not merely a boundary, it is a spiritual act, a psychological turning point, an awakening of the soul. It is the moment you stop waiting for the world to love you correctly and begin offering yourself the love you are always worthy of. This internal shift may go unnoticed by others, but its power is seismic. It reorients your life. It breaks the ancestral chain of self-abandonment, and it whispers to the wounded child within, you don't have to prove yourself worthy anymore. Freud once spoke of the pleasure principle, that unconscious force that drives us to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But when your nervous system has learned to associate love with suffering, the lines between pleasure and pain become blurred. Emotional confusion takes root. You begin to crave intensity, not intimacy. Adrenaline, not tenderness. You chase after emotional chaos, mistaking it for connection. But what you're really feeling is not love. It's the echo of a familiar wound replaying itself in the theater of your heart. Real love is not a performance. It's not earned through endurance, and it is never built on the foundation of humiliation. The moment you declare, I will not carry what is not mine, you are reclaiming your power from every story that taught you to shrink in order to be chosen. That is not rejection. That is return, a return to yourself. And though others may not notice when you quietly stop tolerating what once wounded you, your soul does. It knows. From that knowledge, everything begins to change. What makes many of these unacceptable behaviors so damaging is not their violence, but their subtlety. They do not always come with loud voices or visible scars. They arrive gently, wrapped in the arms of those you love the most. And that is what makes them so dangerous. You don't know how to set boundaries with someone you still idealize. You silence yourself, not because you don't see the harm, but because you still hope love can redeem it. Jung called this illusion the great entanglement, the belief that another will save us. But salvation doesn't come from others. It begins the moment you stop betraying yourself for the comfort of familiarity. Transformation doesn't begin with rage. It begins quietly, on the day you finally stand up for something you used to suppress. You do not scream, you do not attack, you speak with clarity, you choose truth over tension, and in that moment, dignity is no longer a distant idea. It becomes the breath behind your words, the spine in your posture, the unwavering silence after your final no. Anyone who truly loves you will not use your wounds as weapons. They will not twist your openness into leverage. Love does not dominate. It does not diminish. It does not manipulate your vulnerability into a tool for control. If someone repeatedly uses your emotional transparency to make you feel small or powerless, that is not love. It is a toxic loop that must be broken, not excused. Jung once said the goal of life is not perfection but wholeness. And wholeness requires the courage to say, I will no longer accept what breaks me. To love yourself is not to hate the other. It is to stop abandoning yourself for their comfort. Remaining silent in the face of subtle cruelty is not nobility, it is a fracture of the self. A gradual disconnection from your own essence. You deserve to come home to yourself, to look in the mirror and no longer see someone tolerating what they once called love. That is the beginning of individuation, not the fantasy of being saved, but the power of saving yourself. The most dangerous relationships are not the ones that shout, they are the ones that slowly dim your light without you even noticing. They don't strike, they drain, they minimize. They make you question what you feel, what you know, and eventually who you are. And the most haunting part is that they do it in the name of love. But love, real love, is never a fog of confusion. It does not distort your inner compass or make you shrink to fit someone else's comfort. As Alfred Adler once said, a meaningful life is one where you are free to grow, not one where you must submit or subdue others to belong. If your relationship requires you to abandon parts of yourself just to maintain peace, you are not in love. You are in a psychological prison. It's not always the raised voice that wounds the most. Often, it's the quiet phrases, whispered just loud enough to settle into your subconscious. You're overreacting. It wasn't that bad. You're too sensitive. When these lines repeat, they don't just sting. They construct invisible walls between you and your emotional truth. Over time, you stop trusting your own experience. You begin to believe that your feelings are too much. Your voice is disruptive. Your presence must be edited. The most unacceptable behaviors are not always violent or visible. Sometimes they hide in the ordinary, in the careless shrug, in the cold tone that says, do whatever you want, in the subtle disdain when you express pain. Here you go again with your drama. These aren't just comments. They are emotional daggers dressed in casual language. They don't scream, but they are silent. They don't forbid you, but they erase you, bit by bit. Carl Jung taught us that every relationship is a mirror, and when someone repeatedly makes you feel small, voiceless, or confused, it may not be a reflection of who you are. It may be echoing a wound from long ago that still lives inside you. The wound of not being seen, the wound of being dismissed. But now you are beginning to see it, and what was once invisible can finally be healed. As Viktor Frankl once wrote, suffering is an inescapable part of human life. But there is a profound difference between the suffering that awakens you and the suffering that destroys you. One refines the soul, the other shatters it. And you, right now, watching this, have the sacred right to decide which path you will take. You can choose to return to yourself, to protect the flame of your truth, to walk away from anything that confuses love with control. Maybe there's still a part of you that whispers, but if I stop tolerating this, will I end up alone? That question is the invisible trap hidden within wounded attachments. It convinces you that setting a boundary means losing love. But what you're really losing is not love, it's dependency. Love nurtures freedom. Dependency demands your silence in exchange for affection. As Jung taught, the soul cannot fake coherence. You can perform the role of someone who's fine, smiling on social media, saying you've got it all under control. But if beneath that surface lies a constant ache, insomnia, anxiety, or confusion, something deeper is pleading to be acknowledged. You are not reading this by accident. A part of you is awakening, a part of you that no longer wants half-truths, half-lived lives. This part of you is tired of bending, shrinking, and apologizing just to feel worthy of staying. And while this moment may not come with fireworks or applause, it marks the quiet beginning of a life where you can finally breathe without guilt. The day you decide to stop negotiating your peace is the day emotional healing truly begins. That's not the day you become someone new. It's the day you finally return to who you've always been beneath the performance. When Jung said the greatest privilege of life is to become who you truly are, he also said this: stop disguising yourself just to be accepted. Because what begins as a disguise eventually becomes a disconnection. If you had to become someone else to be loved, then what you experienced wasn't love. It was a transaction. And you didn't come into this life to sell your essence. You came to live your truth. One of the most powerful insights Carl Jung gave us was this: healing cannot come from the surface. It must rise from the roots of the unconscious. That's why when someone makes you feel like your pain is too much or your boundaries are the problem, they are not speaking to your truth. They're projecting their own shadow onto you. Jung was clear. People unconsciously cast out what they can't face within themselves. And every time you allow emotional contempt, you're silently absorbing a darkness that isn't yours to carry. There is one particularly insidious behavior we rarely name: when someone mocks your healing. This may seem subtle, even casual, but it reveals a soul deeply disconnected from its own evolution. Jung taught that individuation, the sacred process of becoming who you truly are, will always disturb those still trapped in their masks. If someone downplays your growth, it's not because you're wrong to evolve. It's because your growth reflects their stagnation. To be invalidated again and again is to slowly lose your sense of self. And Jung reminded us, depression is like a woman dressed in black. When she appears, don't chase her away. Invite her in. Ask what she has come to teach. If your emotions, your sadness, your fear, your anger, are treated as inconveniences, burdens, or exaggerations, then you are not in a safe emotional space. Because your emotions are not flaws, they are messengers from your soul. And it is time you listened. One of the most soul-wounding behaviors through the lens of Jungian psychology is when someone coerces you to betray your own intuition. Jung described intuition not as a fantasy, but as a sacred psychic function. A bridge between the unconscious and the conscious. A quiet knowing that bypasses logic and speaks directly from the soul. So when you find yourself repeatedly doubting what you instinctively feel is wrong, when you silence that inner voice just to preserve a bond, you're not just compromising a boundary, you're surrendering your inner compass. And when your compass breaks, you don't just lose direction, you lose yourself. To tolerate the constant minimization of your emotional efforts is to endure a form of subtle violence. Jung insisted that the soul, much like a child, needs recognition to flourish. When your attempts to grow, heal, or simply be heard are dismissed as excessive, dramatic, or unnecessary, the message becomes deafening in its silence. No matter what you do, it will never be enough. And this is one of the most devastating beliefs the human psyche can absorb. Because once you internalize it, you stop trying. Not from weakness, but from quiet despair. When someone demands your forgiveness without ever transforming their behavior, what they're asking for is not redemption, it's immunity. They're not seeking healing. They're seeking permission to harm again without psychology echoes what John once said. Real change doesn't come from saying sorry, it comes from confronting one's own inner chaos. And if someone continues the same patterns while refusing to examine their shadow, they are not evolving. They are emotionally manipulating you under the disguise of vulnerability. Forgiveness does not mean reopening the door to the same pain. Forgiveness means releasing the weight from your own soul, not re-entering the fire that burned you. One of the most common misunderstandings is the belief that empathy means self-erasure. Jung would have said the opposite. Sacrifice, when not resentment, and resentment is a signal, not of your failure, but of the silent contract you have been accepted. If you are always the one who adjusts, softens, and swallows their voice just to keep the peace, you're not in a partnership, you're in a one-sided emotional structure, slowly draining your spirit. Jung reminded us that there is no individuation without separation. Sometimes the most loving act you can offer yourself is walking away from the very person who insists they love you. Real love does not require you to disappear in order for it to survive. If a relationship demands the sacrifice of your mental peace to keep it intact, then it is no longer love. It has become survival. And when you hold back your truth to avoid upsetting someone else, you're doing the very opposite of what Jung asked of us, to make the unconscious conscious. Everything you suppress accumulates. It doesn't disappear, it mutates. It becomes insomnia, explain. If you are in a relationship where you cannot express what you feel without fearing how the other person will react, you are not safe. You are emotionally imprisoned. So, before you move on from this moment, I invite you to pause, breathe in deeply, close your eyes, and repeat silently within yourself, "My soul deserves to be heard, not ignored." And if this message has stirred something in you, leave that sentence in the comments. Not for us, for you, as a declaration, as a vow, as a sacred turning point. My soul deserves to be heard, not ignored. Let it be your new foundation, because you cannot build a meaningful life if the walls of your heart are held up by the silent betrayal of your own dignity. Carl Jung once said that one of the most widespread illnesses of the modern soul is the forgetting of oneself. But this kind of forgetting doesn't arrive with fanfare. It creeps in quietly. You don't realize how far you've strayed from yourself until you catch yourself justifying pain, tolerating the intolerable, and labeling as love what is in truth emotional dependency wrapped in illusion. From Alfred Adler's perspective, many of the behaviors we put up with have little to do with love or respect, and far more to do with unconscious compensation for deep-seated feelings of inferiority. In other words, the less worthy you feel on the inside, the more willing you are to accept emotional crumbs from the outside. But you were not born to survive on scraps. You were born to sit at the sacred table of your truth. There are relationships that don't teach you how to love. They only teach you how to endure. And the longer you spend learning endurance, the more you drift from your essence. That inner disconnection becomes a hollow so profound that when real love finally appears, your nervous system doesn't know how to trust it. The soul, trained for survival, cannot easily surrender to tenderness. Erich Fromm described love not as a mere feeling, but as an art, a discipline that demands emotional maturity, responsibility, mutual respect, and knowledge. So if you find yourself in a bond where you must constantly explain the basics, like why it's not okay to yell, to lie, or to ignore you, then you're not in a relationship rooted in emotional partnership. You're entangled in a projection, an immature echo of someone still unable to relate from a place of awakened consciousness. One of the great psychological trials of adulthood is breaking free from the emotional savior complex, the seductive trap where you believe that your love alone will awaken someone else. However, as Jung warned, no one truly transforms until they are forced to confront their own shadow. And if you are doing the emotional labor that belongs to the other, you are not rescuing them. You are enabling their immaturity. When you continue to tolerate behaviors that wound your spirit, your unconscious mind doesn't perceive your tears, it perceives your consent. Because the body speaks, even when your voice shakes. The soul feels, even when your lips stay sealed. And if you remain, even while you cry, even while you ache in silence, what your nervous system records is, "This must be acceptable." But it isn't. And deep down, your soul has always known that truth. Viktor Frankl once said that inner freedom is the last of the human liberties, even in the face of suffering. But let us be clear, tolerating humiliation, emotional neglect, manipulation, or psychological blackmail is not a sign of strength. It is an unconscious surrender. And where there is surrender of the inner truth, there can be no authentic life. The wound of "I'm not enough" deepens each time you choose someone who mirrors back that very emptiness. It becomes a cycle, one that feeds itself. The less you value yourself, the more you'll gravitate toward people who affirm that void. And the more they confirm your unworthiness, the harder it becomes to escape. That is why true healing begins not with affection from another, but with disruption of the cycle. And disruption begins with awakening. Carl Rogers spoke of the necessity of unconditional positive regard, a radical self-love that doesn't depend on how attractive, productive, or emotionally composed you are. It means loving yourself even in your brokenness, even when your strength fails, when your spirit trembles, when your clarity dissolves into confusion. Because if someone only loves the version of you that is put together, they do not love you. They love the mask. And you, my dear soul, were never born to live behind a mask. There are relationships that do not meet us as equals, but reduce us to children, fragile, cautious, seeking approval, where you must behave correctly just to avoid being punished.